thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. This has really been an exciting 24 hours for me to be involved in all this, and I thank you all for it. A little nervous that every time I'm mentioned as the keynote speaker, like you've been waiting 2 days to hear this talk. I don't know, puts a little pressure on me, but I think you've probably had a whole 24 hours of keynote talks, starting with Ryan's last night. The student papers were great. My colleagues did a great job. So let's just think of this as one among many speeches you've heard on Adam Smith, and that will be good. I wanted to mention that this paper was sort of constructed with business ethics in mind. Mainly the issue was what would a business ethics look like from a Smithian point of view? And I will get to business ethics at the end. You won't see it at the beginning, but I will say some things about that at the end. And the other preliminary thing I wanted to mention is I'm going to try to put the passages that are, either I won't read them all because they're too long, or I will read them, but then you can read them with me up here on the screen, and hopefully I can actually click and do my paper at the same time. I know that's like walking and chewing gum, but I'll do my best and see if I can get it done that way. I know a professor of economics who once told me that he used to stand up in front of his class when they were doing the Wealth of Nations, and he would say, if any of you can find a single passage in the Wealth of Nations where businessmen are favorably presented, I'll give you $1,000. This is actually a fairly famous economist. I'll keep his name to myself, but it raises a kind of interesting question, because if that's how businessmen are actually portrayed in the Wealth of Nations, this is the book that supposedly is the big defense of capitalism, the big defense of business, and yet he could make this claim, and that seems a bit strange. Historically, there's been the claim that The Wealth of Nations is a very different book from The Theory of Moral Sentiments, but that too is a very odd thing, that a man would be so divided he could do these two books that have nothing to do with each other. I'm going to try to dispel some of the myths connected with these things, but I should say that I'm going to focus on commerce, or what I'm calling commerce in this presentation. But I don't pretend to have a whole interpretation here. That would really be beyond what we can get done. I'm going to limit myself to what I call the characteristics of commercial society, especially characteristics of a commercial actor. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to limit myself to certain subgroups like managers, laborers, employers, but to commercial actors generally, since Smith clearly measures the conduct of individuals or groups against general social norms of appropriateness. In exploring this, I'll be offering what I would call an aesthetic reading of Adam Smith. I shall, in other words, be arguing that an important dimension of commercial conduct is the vision, what I'm calling the vision of the actors, both as they see themselves fitting into society and as they envision various elements of their own lives. By vision, I mean an act of the imagination whereby diverse elements are regarded by the agent as fitting together in such a way that their relationship becomes normative for determining what is and is not appropriate. If that sounds complicated, I think it'll clear itself up as we go along here. Okay, the title of this paper and the theme of which we're working comes from the opening sentence of TMS, which, hang on one second. There we go. Most of you, especially if you've been here the last 24 hours, are quite familiar with this statement.
Went past it,
I won it? Oh, sorry. There we go. Howsoever selfish man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others. That's my clever pun, because when you talk about business and commerce, you're talking about fortunes. So anyway, all right. I told you nobody would laugh at that. Anyway, so I worked with this, start with this sentence. As the passage suggests, it is the case that human beings have a natural interest in the fortune of others, or what Smith calls the fortune of others here. So we open our inquiry here with a kind of paradox, for it would seem on the face of it that commercial action is quintessentially not about taking an interest in the fortune of others, but rather about taking an interest in your own fortune. Or to put the point somewhat more accurately, our interest in the fortune of others, insofar as we are commercial actors, is predicated entirely upon how those others contribute to our own fortune, their value resting solely upon the degree to which they do so. Smith's passage, however, suggests something different, namely that irrespective of what they do for us, we have an interest in the fortune of others. The passage also suggests that we would both have other-oriented concerns in commercial relations, and that perhaps an important part of acting properly and successfully in such contexts is to have such concerns. At least that's what I'm going to argue. To help us understand the nature of the commercial actor, it would seem that the first and most obvious place to look would be Smith's discussion of the prudent man in TMS 6, since, if for no other reason, ordinary discourse tends to make prudence the central virtue of commerce. So I'm going to start there. The general point of the section 6 in TMS, is to discuss how one's character can affect one's own happiness and what qualities of character are needed to accomplish the end. This personal quality Smith defines as prudence, and I don't think I need to read the quotation. I'll just go on. You can read it as I'm speaking if you like. Despite the fact that prudence is a virtue oriented towards one's own happiness, it does not follow that such an orientation means a lack of consideration for others. Indeed, Smith tells us explicitly the following. The desire of becoming the proper object of this respect, of deserving and obtaining this credit and rank among our equals, is perhaps the strongest of all our desires, and our anxiety to obtain the advantages of fortune is accordingly much more excited and irritated by this desire, and so on. Okay, so it's very important what others think of us in some way. Our own happiness is thus inextricably oriented towards others. Indeed, one would expect that our anxiety, which he mentions in this passage, over obtaining such respect would no doubt influence the very ways we choose to affect our own fortunes. In any case, it's clear that this desire for respect is also a central feature of the constraints upon our conduct and the source of the norms that come to guide that conduct. Okay, sorry. And this second passage from Smith suggests that people who are involved and who are successful in commerce do care about their standing in society, their reputation, and so forth. I won't read that either. In thus coming to understand in what prudence consists, we learn that the first and principal object of prudential conduct for Smith is security. Although security initially means not exposing ourselves to or minimizing risks that will adversely affect our health, fortune, and social standing, it also has a positive side, namely the development of, quote, real knowledge and skill in our trade and profession, assiduity and industry in the exercise of it, frugality, and even some degree of parsimony in all our expenses, end quote. Hence, the prudent man does not simply avoid risk, but seeks improvement, this is important, of his condition through knowledge and skill development. The outcome of the possession of these qualities is that, quote, the prudent man is always both supported and rewarded by the entire approbation of the impartial spectator, end quote. The idea that security incorporates a particular kind of drive towards improvement, as just described, implies that we cannot take security to mean simply the realization of a state of well-being. It refers also to certain qualities of mind useful for securing such improvement. Smith is explicit about this. Okay. The qualities most useful to ourselves are, first of all, superior reason and understanding, by which we are capable of discerning the remote consequences of all our actions, and of foreseeing the advantage or detriment which is likely to result from them. And secondly, self-command. Okay. Skipping down a couple lines, these two qualities consist in the virtue of prudence. So somehow superior reason and understanding with self-command combined are what he means by the virtue of prudence. The cultivation of a superior reason and understanding thus marks the essential intellectual quality of the prudent individual. If left to this passage alone, one would be tempted to read superior reason and understanding in pragmatic consequentialist terms. It is not, however, because the consequences are so beneficial to the individual that superior reason and understanding are approved. Rather, strangely, it's almost the reverse. Namely, because superior reason and understanding are regarded to be valuable in themselves, the consequences of their cultivation are given such approval. So first we approve of reason and understanding, then we approve of the benefits that come from it. In this regard, it is the effort to make reason practical rather than inherent practicality of certain forms of reasoning that marks the Smithian prudent individual. Smith's extension of the notion of practical wisdom beyond the pragmatic is coupled, as we saw in the passage above, with the quality of self-command. Self-command, in this context, is what makes possible, quote, the frugality and even some degree of parsimony we are to exercise with the resources in our charge. Yet one of the interesting features of self-command in this context is that it's predicated upon the impartial spectator being unable to distinguish between present and future desires. Quoting Smith, "The spectator does not feel the solicitations of our present appetites. To him, the pleasure we are to enjoy a week hence or a year hence is just as interesting as that which we are to enjoy this moment," end quote. So indeed, when we actually do sacrifice a present pleasure for a future one, quote, our conduct appears to the spectator absurd, and he cannot enter into the principles which influence it, end quote. Very counterintuitive. Our personal preference rankings thus remain opaque to the impartial spectator. Yet rather than being a reason for undermining respect for self-command, Smith argues for the opposite. Since there seems to be no reason to forego a present pleasure for a later one, the spectator is surprised by those capable of doing so, as the spectator realizes that most actors would find this trade-off too difficult to execute. From this ability to do so, however, quote, arises the eminent esteem with which all men naturally regard a steady perseverance in the practice of frugality, industry, and application, though directed to no other purpose than the acquisition of fortune. The resolute firmness of the person who acts in this matter necessarily commands our approbation, end quote. Notice again that it is not the quantity of benefits that impresses the spectator, but the quality of character. Indeed, because we approve of such conduct, quote, it is the consciousness of this merited approbation and esteem which is alone capable of supporting the agent in his tenor of conduct, end quote. The security we seek from the prudent conduct is thus less in the end the security of body and comfort than it is a security of social acceptance in the form of merited approbation. This last point marks an interesting conclusion. If commerce is a function of prudence, then commerce would seem to depend more on qualities of character than upon expected utility. The different forces acting upon the prudent individual, especially the desire to benefit oneself and the desire to obtain approval and respect of others, represent rather different, though potentially complementary taskmasters. These two forces are jointly operative in an endeavor to make one fit for society, with the second being given as much, if not more, attention than the first. The individual therefore pleases herself by pleasing others. Yet the process is not a haphazard or passive one. We actively seek such affirmation and moderate our interests accordingly. The desire to benefit oneself and to gain the respect of others are essentially natural dispositions. Although both these natural propensities factor into the nature of prudence, prudence is finally realized only upon the presence of a third consideration, the approval of the impartial spectator. The third taskmaster appears, as we've noted, to have little interest in benefits. The impartial spectator seems moved by qualities of character alone. We thus moderate our own desires and interests to achieve what Smith calls a correspondence of sentiment between ourselves and others. Fitting ourselves into society is thus in our interest, though Smith is quite clear it is not selfish. The endeavor thus to adapt ourselves to others and they to us is refined by the introduction of the impartial spectator who helps monitor our fittingness. Okay, let's see if there's anything here. Okay, I think this just repeats the quotation, or it just repeats what I've just said, so you can look at it. So we seek not only approval, but approval for the right reasons. So that's what we're after. Understanding prudence in the way just described can help us in reconciling the conflicting tendencies found in a famous example of Smith's known as the poor man's son example, which has been discussed, I think, at virtually every session today, which is found in TMS 4. In this example, a poor man's son, quote, whom heaven in its anger has visited with ambition, end quote, is obsessed with obtaining the sorts of goods possessed by the rich. The extended toil and unhappiness the poor man's son undergoes in his pursuit of wealth seems contrary to what one would expect from the reputed defender of commercial life, for the picture painted by Smith about seeking wealth is certainly not an attractive one. The poor man's son is seduced by the image of the life of the rich, which, quote, strikes the imagination as something grand and beautiful and noble, of which the attainment is well worth all the toil and anxiety, which we are so apt to bestow upon it, end quote. The reality is rather different from the image, however, for neither the poor man's son nor the rich actually achieves the degree of happiness that the image would suggest. Nevertheless, we're all to some degree seduced by images of this sort. Smith's point in this section of TMS is to show that the sort of beauty just mentioned in the passage has superiority over utility in motivating even commercial action. In other words, we are moved more by the picture of the life we are to lead than the realities that attend the actual living of it. And it is this very expectation that is important for the incentive towards commerce. Another famous passage which discusses the deception that we have, which keeps the continual motion in the industry of mankind. It is this, in this connection, it's interesting that the poor man's son, who apparently actually achieves the wealth he seeks, is not admired by Smith's description of him for his prudence, which we have every reason to suppose helped him gain his wealth. The issue of prudence does not come up at all in this context. Only the distance between the life imagined and the degree of actual pleasure and tranquility gained in its pursuit. Whether the poor man's son is happy or not is essentially irrelevant to the spectator, because as we saw earlier, the spectator is indifferent between current and future pleasures and costs that may be experienced by the individual. The impartial spectator cares not about utility, perhaps because utility is particularized, making any suffering the poor man's son experiences beside the point for the spectator. The poor man's son may be deceived about what degree of happiness his life will actually possess, but provided he adheres to the judgments of the impartial spectator along the way, his fitness for society ends up serving society itself. Commerce thus does not lie to anyone. It promises only fittingness and progress, not personal happiness. In this way, Smith can reasonably claim that one can have unfavorable attitudes towards many of the actors within a commercial society while still being favorably disposed to the commercial society generally. The poor man's son, like the rest of us, though perhaps with more ambition, desires to improve his condition and benefit himself. With a vision of a certain form of life, however, particular transactions will be directed towards an end that endeavors to put them together in accordance with a certain envisioned coherent pattern. The imagined pattern creates a form of fittingness, rendering the particular utility of the transactions at any given moment of secondary concern. It's not just that one is willing to forego a current pleasure to receive a greater one later. That perspective is still too bound up with expected utility to explain the poor man's son's sacrifice. One needs instead a larger vision, one that certainly holds the promise of greater utility, but which draws us in by its own attractiveness, without having to be a function of a calculation of exact payoff of that utility, or even when it will arrive. Moreover, the vision needs to be one that holds up whether things are going well or badly at any given moment. Ironically, perhaps, the successful, that is, a prudent commercial actor, is one not only proficient at conserving resources, but is also moved by a beautiful vision, that is, by a conception of fittingness. One is perhaps tempted to see the poor man's son as the quintessential commercial actor, always deceived by a false vision of the good life, as are the rich he emulates. Our point here, however, is quite the opposite. Instead of holding up the poor man's son as the core commercial actor, my own position is that commercial life is so suited to our nature that even deceptions can be reconciled to our benefit. The poor man's son is one extreme, end of a continuum where one's aspirational vision of life is distinct from the actual utility received. But without this type of vision, generally, there would be no motivation for improvement, whatever level of utility is finally received. Consequently, though a commercial setting may not always produce the fullest form of our own humanity, not to mention optimal individual happiness, it may be the most natural setting for reconciling the tensions that can arise between the benefits to self and others, progress and tradition, consequence and duty. Commercial orders are hospitable to developing in us a sense of what is fitting, both with respect to what is needed to coordinate all the elements of our lives, as well as what is required to coordinate with others. all of which in turn can be a more powerful draw upon our actions than expected utility. The commercial order being one that follows the rules of justice but otherwise leaves people free to pursue their own ends is for that reason inclined towards rewarding harmonizing forces, both with respect to individuals as they formulate their own plans and by society generally. Indeed, Smith's system of natural liberty, his term for commercial order, is natural in just this sense, namely that it encourages endeavors to create unity from diversity through adaptation, mutual influence, and ordered plans of action. Okay, moving from this first section on prudence to the next one. The discussion in the last session, or section on prudence individual within a commercial order, offers a picture of what I would call a natural state of a normal human being. That is, a condition we were meant to enjoy should we succeed in reconciling the diverse propensities of our nature within our likely circumstances. We have described, or I've described above and mentioned above, self-love, the desire for merited social esteem, care in the use of resources, the desire to improve our condition, the propensity to exchange, the growth in our knowledge as either natural or developed propensities that secure this natural state. So all these things have been involved in what we've been talking about. Perhaps we need only mention, in addition, Smith's view that, quote, man was made for action. So to suggest that our active management and integration of these various propensities and dispositions is the basic business of life. In this regard, our natural state is characterized by what might be called, or what I'm calling, extended prudence. Extended prudence differs from both a narrower form of physical comfort and security and what Smith himself calls superior form, to be mentioned in a moment. Extended prudence thus incorporates the various forms of self-command and exhibits itself as follows. I will read this passage. Temperance, decency, modesty, and moderation are always amiable and can seldom be directed to any bad end. It is from the unremitting steadiness of those gentler exertions of self-command and the amiable virtue of chastity that the respectable virtues of industry and frugality derive all their sober luster which attends them. The conduct of all those who are contented to walk in the humble paths of private and peaceable life derives from the same principle the greater part of the beauty and grace which belong to it. A beauty and grace which, though much less dazzling, is not always less pleasing than those which accompany the more splendid actions of the hero, the statesman, or the legislator. From the narrow forms of prudence concerned mainly with industry and frugality to the gentler exertions of self-command which lead to the beauty and grace characteristic of a life of extended prudence, these words by Smith depict the core of the normal life for those not thrown into circumstances of having to be a hero, a statesman, or a legislator. Notice that the appeal of this life is once again understood in terms of the pull offered by beauty and grace, rather than by benefits and accomplishments, though certainly these latter accompany it. All that is missing from the foregoing descriptions are the qualities of character that affect the happiness of other people, such as family, friends, countrymen, which Smith treats in a passage, treats prior to the passage I just read, and which concern his other major virtues besides prudence, namely benevolence and justice. As the above passage suggests, the life depicted is in fact a pleasing one, and thus is consequently in accord with the endorsement of the spectator, who, quote, is most disposed to sympathize with sensations more or less agreeable to the person principally concerned, end quote. If indeed the spectator is our standard for assessing appropriate patterns of living, one need not pause long to realize how much more attracted we are to the life described above than we are to the description of the poor man's son mentioned earlier. There is something inharmonious about the relationship between the poor man's son's image of his life and his actual experience of it. We find none of that in the foregoing passage. Moreover, it's not simply that the foregoing passage pleases us more than reading about the poor man's son. We actually believe that the person depicted in the passage, or the persons depicted in the passage, are more suited to society than the poor man's son. Even though the poor man's son is never completely devoid of sociality, it is no doubt the limited dimensionality of the poor man's son that disturbs us, sort of focused only in one kind of direction and ignoring everything else in his life. There is little doubt that the push to many of our actions is expected utility, but the pull is what I'm calling beauty. Beauty here means a form of fitness whose elements are coordinated in our imagination in a way that we feel they are supposed to be related. And as Smith puts it, quote, that this fitness should be more valued than the very end for which a given convenience was intended, and that the exact adjustment of the means for attaining any conveniency or pleasure should frequently be more regarded than the very conveniency or pleasure itself. This turns out to make the pull more powerful than the push of utility. Smith illustrates this point just prior to the poor man's example, one that I actually like better in some ways, with an example of somebody walking into his room where the furniture has been misarranged. Because of his conception of how the room should be arranged, to achieve the most conveniency, in Smith's language, he's moved to put in order the furniture, even though, quote, to attain this conveniency, he voluntarily puts himself to more trouble than all he could have suffered from want of it, since nothing was more easy than to have set himself down on one of the pieces of furniture, which is probably what he does when he's done rearranging it. So basically he's saying he walks in, he sees the room's misarranged, he can't stand the idea that all this stuff is out of place, he puts it back in place, and then he rests. So the amount of utility he got out of it's a whole less than all the effort he had to put in to arrange the furniture, when all he had to do was just go in and sit down, right? But it's because he can't stand the notion that things are out of order that he's moved to make this rearrangement of the furniture. Like the poor man's son, this person's more moved by the fittingness of things than by the actual calculated utility of his action. And like the poor man's son, he may have, on balance, expended more effort than he gained back in pleasure for the sake of fittingness. We have seen from our foregoing discussion that there is more than just a suggestion here that prosperity may depend on beauty in the sense of actors being motivated by a vision of how various dimensions of their lives can and should be fitted together. Commercial activity understood simply as trade misses this dimension because exchange needs to be undertaken to some purpose to turn benefit into progress. The more expanded and integrated the vision, both with respect to one's own projects and also with how those projects coordinate with other social processes, the more likely it is that our actions are suited to prosperity. In a way, beauty in this sense is a form of efficiency and a means to the conservation of resources. For a well-integrated vision is one that also ensures that actions are not wasted, because they are measured in terms of how those actions conform to or express the vision that defines them, defines their fittingness. Smith does contrast narrower forms of prudence with what he calls superior prudence, which is, quote, wise and judicious conduct when directed to greater and nobler purposes than the care of the health, the fortune, and the rank and reputation of the individuals is frequently called superior prudence. Yet by the time Smith gets to these lines, he's already moved well beyond what has general applicability. The foregoing is meant to illustrate that extended prudence, while certainly a version of superior prudence, is the sort of prudence most suited to the ordinary persons living and acting in a commercial order. It is clear that the extended prudence involves some sort of Aristotelian mean between excesses of various sorts, but we've seen that the mean seems to be a balanced state where dispersed and often opposing forces are harmonized in some way according to a conception of their mutual fittingness, which envisioned together constitute a form of beauty. Excesses are deviations from this state. The commercial society may permit men of system to indulge their vision, may not permit, I should say, men of system to indulge their vision of social order by using individuals as mere pieces in a fashioning of that order, but commercial society does allow individuals to pursue their respective visions within constraints offered by their need for recognition, acceptance, and propriety. Indeed, by emphasizing individual responsibility, the commercial society thereby encourages development of such visions, since one's role in society must be created as opposed to defined, as would be the case where an individual's station in life is fixed, as has been true of so many societies historically. What has thus emerged clearly from our foregoing discussion is that success in the commercial order is not necessarily equivalent to what is thought of as commercial success. They are not opposed. Indeed, they are meant to be reconciled. Okay? But the standard Smith uses to measure success is more a function of the happiness of the individual and the agreeability of the impartial spectator than it is with the utility or accumulation. The reason, as we've seen, is precisely because beauty is finally more compelling than utility. We are drawn more to those with a sense of how their life fits together than to those who merely accumulate. Yet, if commercial success can be distinguished from success in a commercial society, what is their connection, and how are they finally to be integrated? To that issue I now turn. In a world where norms exhibited in action are not supplied by authority and hierarchy, but result from mutual interaction and adaptation, and are thus largely a function of social context, it is nonetheless possible to employ a distinction first made by Aristotle between practical wisdom and cleverness. Cleverness is, now quoting Aristotle, the ability to do things that tend towards the mark we have set for ourselves and hit it, end quote. Practical wisdom depends upon this ability, for without the ability to achieve one's ends, one's actions would be ineffective and there would be virtually no practice. But the ability to achieve one's ends says nothing about the value or the appropriateness of those ends, or that one is doing anything other than satisfying one's desire. Aristotle's person of practical wisdom, by contrast, organizes his or her desires according to his or her insight into the nature of the good, thereby knowing what's appropriate. The distinction between cleverness and practical wisdom is rather important for our overall point here, because in the realm of commerce, it's quite easy to conflate cleverness with practical wisdom. From popular literature to public opinion, the ability to simply get what one wants has been thought to be the mark of commercial success and the essence of commercial conduct. But Smith, for example, speaks unfavorably of the, quote, natural selfishness and rapacity of the rich, who mean only their own conveniency and the gratification of their own and insatiable desires, end quote. That one might be adept at satisfying those desires would not mollify Smith's judgment here. Smith thus clearly distinguishes between the mere ability to satisfy one's desires and the ability to do so under certain appropriate restraints and conditions. Success for Smith always means the achievement of ends in appropriate ways, never merely achievement of ends. So if commercial society could be described as the utilization of resources in conjunction with such utilization by others under conditions of appropriateness, then successful commercial activity would always include some measurement in terms of outcomes. In the end, consequently, the goal for Smith seems to be one where characters can be matched with outcomes. Okay, this is another long quotation, but probably worth at least going through most of it. The characters of men, as well as the contrivances of art or the institutions of civil government, may be fitted either to promote or disturb the happiness both of the individual and society. The prudent, the equitable, the active, the resolute, and sober character promises prosperity and satisfaction both to the person himself and to everyone connected with him. The rash, the insolent, the slothful, effeminate, voluptuous, on the contrary, forebodes ruin to the individual and misfortune to all that have anything to do with him. The first turn of mind has at least all the beauty, which can belong to the most perfect machine that was ever invented for promoting the most agreeable purpose. And the second, all the deformity, the most awkward and clumsy contrivance. Okay, there we have beauty again. The beauty of commerce thus does issue in prosperity, though the formation of certain types, through the formation of certain types of characters. It's wisdom in the Aristotelian sense, namely that Smithian prudence seeks the alignment of virtue and success. It's not always possible, but that's what it seeks. Okay, our argument's been roughly as follows. It's not utility maximization that gives the market system its strongest appeal or even that captures the strongest motivations of the actors within it. Rather, when considered as a whole, the constraints imposed by the commercial order upon the actions and characters of its participants through mutual adaptation help define what is fitting to that order and, as a result, what harmonizes it as an order. The beauty of commerce in this perspective lies precisely in the integrated order that results from the reconciliation of diversity and plurality. This typically has been the invisible hand notion attributed to Adam Smith, where the order of the market would seem to arise as if an invisible hand were guiding it to that order. The beauty here comes from imagining the reconciliation of an immeasurably large number of particular actions into an ordered whole. Our focus, however, has also been upon the acting agent and the meaning of beauty of commerce with respect to her. Here, beauty as fittingness has two dimensions. One, the use of resources according to some vision of their proper disposition, and 2, the formation of a moral character that arises as the agent seeks to fit herself into her surrounding society. Again, there's an ordered reconciliation of plurality. Both of these dimensions of beauty are pulls upon one's specific actions and can be significantly more powerful than utility. Both the dimensions of the commercial order depend upon the agent being subjected to social controls in her interactions with others. Individually, the person is shaped by her desire for respect. Socially, her commercial activities are monitored by various institutions and norms. Smith himself at least partially anticipates the question of whether the great society that we now live in could put some strains upon both these dimensions of the acting commercial agent's endeavors to integrate. The anonymity of the mass society might loosen the constraints others place upon the agent and indeed possibly lessen the agent's ability to recognize such constraints. The loosening of constraints, it may in turn weaken the need on the part of the agent for an ordered vision of the use of resources, the consequence of which might play in favor of cleverness, what could be equivalent to short-sightedness or narrowness, and away from prudence. The easing of social constraints blurs the distinction between cleverness and prudence and loosens the importance of social respect. Then the mechanism Smith relies upon to ensure the beauty of commerce could be in trouble. The tendency towards globalization in today's business world might give one every reason to believe that social mechanisms for monitoring the conduct of firms are absent. Recent financial crises and pronouncements of the failures of capitalism might suggest that globalization has indeed left firms outside of the sorts of constraining mechanisms Smith was envisioning for smaller social frameworks. Such concerns may indeed be justified. Yet before rushing to judgment on this matter, it's important to remind ourselves that most firms do indeed operate within more localized environments. Large international firms may capture most of the media attention, but the bulk of commercial enterprises are still subject to many of the constraints we've identified. Even in the case of large multinational firms, it's important to recognize that they too remain under certain checks upon their conduct aside from the ordinary market forces of supply and demand. Besides governmental regulations and laws, the forces exerted upon firms include outside investment firms, credit rating agencies, executive compensation markets, mechanisms for corporate social control, consumer confidence, and prestige in an industry. All these are still operating. In this regard, we might follow Jonathan Macy, who's written insightfully on corporate governance in maintaining that social capital both is and can be a significant factor in regulating the governance of corporations. Macy imagines two groups of market participants. One is highly reputationally sensitive, while the other is composed of a, quote, deviant subculture whose members feel free to flaunt the norms of the dominant community. The goal, in strongly Smithian fashion, is to find managers who are members of the first group. It is there, if there is to be any meaningful corporate form of corporate social governance. So Macy points out the following. He says, norms are a low-cost substitute for other corporate governance mechanisms. More important, from a corporate governance perspective, contracts and laws simply are not possible unless a sufficient amount of social capital has been generated by informal norms. Without social capital, people will not obey the laws or abide by contracts when it is not in their personal interest to do so. In the absence of sufficient levels of social capital, the trust necessary for investment will not exist. In this regard, Macy also mentions that, quote, the incentives related to social status, such as the desire for prestige and the fear of being shamed, are important sources of corporate governance, end quote. None of these mechanisms are sufficient in themselves to create Smith's community of respect, but the overall message is clear. Build up social capital and find mechanisms for distinguishing reputationally sensitive managers from a deviant subculture. Macy notes that it is not always a simple matter to distinguish deviants from the first group of reputationally sensitive managers, because part of the former's cleverness is to give the appearance of reputational sensitivity. The easiest way to disregard social norms while still appearing respectable is to narrow the vision by focusing upon short-term and upon particular aspects of the whole business environment. A recent example of a narrowing of focus might be the movement away from measuring corporate success in terms of a whole range of corporate values, such as product quality, treatment of employees, contribution to the community, return on investment, forward-looking corporate strategies, and integrated and clear corporate identity and the like, and towards one particular measure, such as shareholder value. In this regard, research by John Kay has led him to comment that, quote, I have this one here too. The set of assumptions underlying the shareholder value model has brought about a management preoccupation with short-term financial performance alone to the detriment of creating real economic value. Empirical evidence shows that firms which since the mid-1990s subscribed to this model have actually destroyed shareholder value over the medium term, end quote. Of course, in a discussion such as this one, and from somebody like myself, we can't pretend to have fully evaluated claims one way or the other. My point is only that such a conclusion would not be surprising at all from a Smithian perspective, because the beauty of commerce lies in its outward synthetic vision, not merely in some measure of accumulation. Reputational sensitivity is also a key inducement towards the sorts of character qualities we've suggested accompany extended prudence. This is because in order to be reputationally sensitive, one must be looking outward towards the social environment in which one is acting in order to effectively form a conception of how to integrate within it. But there is also the suggestion in Smith that orienting oneself towards an integrated vision is an effective form of commerce in terms of resource management, personal development, and product integrity. Integrity in this regard may ultimately issue in a call for minding one's own business in a special sort of sense. That is, in a call for remaining within one's spheres of competence and responsibility. Smith regards doing just this as being both natural and appropriate, thereby offering us one final standard of conduct. This is the last quotation. The wisdom which contrived the system of human affections as well as that of every other part of nature seems to have judged that the interest of the great society, the one we're worried about here, of mankind would be best promoted by directing the principal attention of each individual to that particular portion of it, which is most within the sphere both of his abilities and his understanding. The primacy of the aesthetic within the great society may offer endless possibilities for visions that extend beyond one's particular portion, as Smith puts it. But managing one's own resources well means not extending beyond the sphere of one's abilities and one's understanding. The wealth commerce creates may tempt us to reach beyond our grasp in anything from ill-conceived investments to demands for subsidies. But the main beauty of commerce is that its benefits become so manifest when commercial actors remain within their particular portion. Thank you very much.